Hey everybody. So, I'm going to try and make this nice and quick, because you see, every minute that I spend making this video is another minute that I'm not spending playing Tears of the Kingdom. So really, if all you need to know is what my opinion on the game is, I feel like that summarizes it pretty quickly right there. And for anybody who's concerned about spoilers, I do not plan on talking about any kind of specifics about the plot of the game, and while I will be talking about the gameplay, I do not plan on revealing any kind of puzzle solutions or anything like that, and in fact I'll mostly just be talking about the core mechanics. So yeah, this game is amazing. It feels like a straight up improvement on just about every respect of Breath of the Wild, in just about every way. Just everything feels better. The world feels denser and more interesting while not being too dense. It's got way more enemies in it, there's way more interesting abilities to use, the story feels more interesting to me at least, just like every respect of this game feels improved upon. Now, I will say though, that this game is very much Breath of the Wild 2. If you're expecting this game to somehow be completely different in every respect from Breath of the Wild, then you're not going to get that. This is very much the same kind of formula that Breath of the Wild had. You're still going around helping random NPCs for side quests, there's still shrines to find and solve puzzles inside, there's still Koroks to solve and get more Korok seeds to upgrade your inventory, there's all the various races of Hyrule have problems that you need to go out and solve, but the thing is that while yes, it does use that same formula, it feels like it is that formula refined to a point, and the way you approach and solve problems now is way more interesting and unique compared to Breath of the Wild. And as such, I think that the best way to really articulate why I think that Tears of the Kingdom is so much better than Breath of the Wild is to go over the difference between the starting abilities in both of the games and show why the runes in Tears of the Kingdom are so much more interesting and versatile than Breath of the Wild's. So let's start with a refresher on Breath of the Wild's abilities. The abilities that you started with in that game after you beat the tutorial island were the ability to summon bombs, Magnesis, which lets you move metal objects, Cryonis, which lets you summon ice pillars on water, and Stasis, which lets you freeze items in time and then hit them in order to give them a new amount of momentum. The thing about these abilities is that they're still very much designed like classic Zelda abilities. I can feel that the developers were probably afraid of people being able to break the game open too much. So these abilities still have some of those aspects of lock and key design that a lot of classic Zelda games have, even if they are still inherently going to be a lot more versatile, simply due to the fact that Breath of the Wild is a much more open game. Take Magnesis, for example. Magnesis is a fairly powerful ability because it lets you move objects all willy-nilly. However, it only works on metal objects, which means that developers can very tightly control when you're able to use this ability. If there's no metal objects in the environment, you can't use Magnesis. And even when there are metal objects in the environment, you can pretty much only use Magnesis on those objects. Cryonis took this to another level, where you could only use it on water. And like 95% of the map did not have any water on it, therefore you basically could only use it in very specific designed areas where you could actually make a pillar. Now sure, some of the puzzles that required Magnesis and Cryonis were still very fun in order to solve because they were actually designed around those abilities, but in the actual overworld, your ability to actually use those powers was fairly severely limited. Even the bomb runes were fairly limited in their application as well. Now sure, you could use the bombs pretty much whenever you want. An explosion can be used for a lot of things. However, the thing is that I feel like this ability was really only put in as a sort of classic Zelda trope, more than an actual gameplay decision, because its actual puzzle-solving capability is arguably even more limited than the other ones, because you can only really use it to break open rocks to clear a path. And so, as a result, it was pretty much just a lock-and-key solution, except for you always had the key on you because it regenerated every time you used a bomb. So, in puzzles, it was basically just, oh, there's a breakable rock, I guess I'll throw a bomb at it. and that was pretty much the end of the puzzle. Sure, there were a couple other more interesting uses for it, where you could use it to propel an object and things like that, but even that still felt pretty limited because the puzzles that actually required you to use it were very clearly designed around that mechanic. And then in combat, the bombs had to be balanced around the fact that you had an infinite number of them. So they didn't actually deal that much damage like they would in past Zelda games, and instead their utility was a lot more focused on the knockback, which made them a lot less useful in actual combat, even if they were still combat applicable. Finally, I don't think it'll be that controversial for me to say that Stasis was probably a lot of people's favorite ability, and that was because it was by far the most versatile ability in the game. You could use it on basically any physics object and even enemies, and then impart momentum on them in order to redirect them. And the actual use cases that this had, both in and out of combat while exploring the world, just gave you so many different things you could do with it. You could freeze things in combat and redirect projectiles. You could freeze a rock and then send it flying into enemies for damage. You could propel yourself into the air by jumping onto the object before it goes flying. I mean, just look at what speedrunners have done with this ability. It has so many interesting use cases with it. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the other abilities had various cool emergent interactions that players were able to discover and use that made the game a lot more interesting, like the ability to throw a metal boomerang, then catch it with magnesis so that it would keep spinning and then basically become a moving buzzsaw that you could ram into enemies, or launching yourself with bombs in order to get massive distance and speed right away. But a lot of those interactions were very esoteric or more trouble than they were worth to set up, so a lot of players just didn't use them. But it is those kinds of emergent interactions that I think it's clear that Nintendo wanted to emphasize with the new abilities in Tears of the Kingdom. So right off the bat, before I even talk about the gameplay side of the new abilities, I really like how the new abilities actually fit into the narrative a lot more than the old abilities did. In Breath of the Wild, you just kind of got abilities because that's the abilities that they wanted to give you. And like I said, they were perfectly fine abilities and everything, but your ability to control magnets or stop objects in time were just kind of gameplay conceits. They didn't really play into the story or the themes of the narrative at all, whereas the new abilities do a much better job of actually playing into that story. Right off the bat, the Ascendability clearly ties directly into the presence of the new floating islands that are in the sky. Your ability to go up into the air clearly matches up thematically with the presence of there being dozens of islands now floating above everywhere in Hyrule. And your ability to pick up and combine objects together in order to create new structures and constructs clearly ties into the reconstruction of Hyrule and how everybody is finally starting to rebuild their society after the last great calamity. But I won't go into any more detail about that now, just because I don't want to risk spoiling something for someone, since obviously this is highly connected to the narrative itself. So, moving on to the more actual gameplay-oriented side of the new abilities, I think that we should start with Ultra Hand, which I just brought up, because it's actually really interesting in how it not only provides a brand new ability in that you can combine objects together, but it also contains a better version of magnesis within itself. The simple act of actually building a structure requires that you're able to pick up and move objects around, which is exactly like how magnesis worked. Except it's no longer limited to only being able to work on metal objects, which means that just in general, you now have the ability to pick up virtually any physics object in the game and play around with it with Ultra Hand. And previously, the only way to really move non-metallic objects in Breath of the Wild would be to use stasis on it and then apply momentum to it in a sort of very loose way of getting an object from point A to B. So really, at the end of the day, this one ability provides some of the utility of stasis, the entire utility of magnesis, and it's its own new ability on top of that that lets you create these new structures out of thin air that lets you actually solve puzzles in much more interesting and varied ways. Like, I love the shrines that are based around the Ultra Hand ability, because it just gives you a limited set of objects, and then you just have to figure out how you're going to combine these objects into some kind of useful apparatus to actually solve whatever the puzzle is facing you towards. And then on top of that, there's also a new kind of Korok challenge, which is by far my favorite Korok challenge, where you essentially have to escort a Korok with a heavy backpack to another Korok, and the only way to really do that in most of these situations is to build some kind of vehicle capable of transporting him. And on top of that, you even get 2 Korok seats for that, so it's even more rewarding. Like, just everything that you use with Ultra Hand, it feels so fun to come up with these wacky, wild contraptions in order to solve whatever your problem of the moment is. And it's like, it's so varied because I never feel like I'm just always going to build the same thing to solve every problem, simply because you don't always have everything on you, so you're forced to improvise and work with whatever you have. And it's, I could just gush about this ability for a long time, and I probably will in my more full review, but for now, let's just say Ultra Hand is extremely versatile and really fun. Moving on from Ultra Hand, I think that Fuse is the next logical ability to talk about, because it really feels like a logical extension of what Ultra Hand can do. Ultra Hand is about picking up and combining objects to create a greater whole, and Fuse is basically the same concept, but for your equipment that you can actually wield, whether it be your shield, your sword, or your arrows that you fire from your bow. And I think that actually a lot of people before the game came out didn't even realize that this was a separate ability from Ultra Hand, simply because they are so uniquely tied together conceptually. So I think it's a great thematic and logical extension of what they already established Link could do with Ultra Hand. And I've already gone into length talking about how I think that this ability really improves the durability system that we saw in Breath of the Wild. It lets you increase the durability dramatically, and it gives you greater access to the kinds of weapons you probably want, since it lets you just create a hammer out of thin air by combining a rock and a stick, or making an axe in a similar way, or things like that, so that you're not always having to hunt down these random objects in order to have the utility that you want. And of course, a natural side effect of this new ability is that combat is a lot more rewarding than it was in Breath of the Wild. As I've brought up in my previous videos, a common complaint is that after a certain time, combat just didn't feel very rewarding because you would spend your consumable weapons and shields and whatnot in order to fight these monsters, and then the only thing you would get in return in terms of restoring those weapons is whatever weapons the monsters had on them. But oftentimes, random monsters like bokoblins and whatnot would just carry various rocks and sticks that weren't exactly very useful, so at the end of the day, you would often return with a net loss in materials. But with the new Fuse ability, they're able to actually still give monsters crappy weapons if they want to, but they can still have materials that they drop that can be turned into much more powerful weapons, which means that now you can get a lot more powerful equipment from virtually any fight in the game. And then on top of that, it also technically expands your inventory dramatically. Sure, you still have a limited number of weapon, shield, and bow slots and whatnot, but you have an unlimited amount of slots for things like monster parts. So the parts that you would get from monsters that you can fuse into weapons only takes up your unlimited inventory space. And then all you need to do in order to use those is just grab a random stick off the ground or use whatever weapons you can find, and then you can fuse them together, and then as soon as you break something, you can immediately get something else. So while, yes, you have a very limited inventory still, and you can only carry so many weapons, the Fuse ability can really help alleviate that if you're willing to just craft whatever weapons you want for the time that you need to use it. So, moving on, since I want to, finish this video and get back to playing the game as soon as possible, the Ascendability is really interesting, and I think I hit the nail on the head with my predictions on how it's going to be used from a design standpoint. You see, like I said, this ability is extremely versatile on the main overworld, because, well, it's the place that you've already explored in Breath of the Wild, so there's not really a huge need to create a ton of traversal challenges for the player. So this ability allows you to really jump up through mountains and structures and all kinds of crazy stuff really easily and, you know, skip a lot of the difficult climbing that you'd have to do in the base game. But outside of the overworld, when you're in caves or on floating islands and the like, the ability becomes a lot more restrictive, which I think can be a good thing. Yeah, I know I was harping a lot on the Breath of the Wild abilities for being fairly restricted, but I'm not trying to say that restricted abilities are bad. I mean, lots of classic Zelda games had very lock-and-key design with how their abilities work, and I'm not trying to say that every other Zelda game is terrible. That is clearly not my point. But a restricted ability means that it can be used in much more interesting puzzles, and that's what it ends up getting used for a lot in floating islands and in caves. Like I said, in a cave, it can serve as a great get-out-of-jail-free card, where they don't need to worry about tying the end of the cave back to the beginning so that the player can get out more quickly, because you can just ascend out of the cave, no problem. And then on floating islands, well, the islands aren't exactly above each other 100% of the time, so usually you have to figure out where you can overlap on the islands in order to get from one island to another. And there's even some interesting videos I've already seen of people building structures so that they can get under another island and then use that position in order to ascend up to the surface. So there's still a lot of creative leeway in how the ability is designed. And finally, we get to Recall, and Recall is a really interesting ability. It's clearly analogous to the Stasis ability from the previous game, but its use cases are completely different. And I was actually a little bit worried from the previews that we saw that this ability would mostly just be used to ascend to the Sky Islands, because we saw clips where you could see rubble falling from the sky, and then you can use Recall to go up to the sky from that rubble and just ride it back up. And then I thought that that would be like the most common way you get to Sky Islands, but I'm actually glad to see that that is not the case, and oftentimes rubble will just fall in the middle of nowhere near any kind of islands that you can possibly glide to, and it just kind of serves as a really quick way to get a lot of altitude, which is really nice. But then it also has a lot of different uses beyond that ability, where you could say reverse projectiles that are thrown at you to immediately damage whoever threw them at you. And there's even really interesting uses in contraption building. A really useful little tip that I figured out, if you're trying to, say, build a flying machine, but you can't really launch it in some way, well, what you can do is use Ultra Hand to lift the machine up into the air, hold it there for a few seconds, then put it back down, then jump onto your flying machine, then use Recall so that now it goes back in time to when you were holding it up in the air, and then you can end the recall early so that it can get that flying head start and immediately start flying off into the air. And I mean, that's really the core of why I think that these abilities are so much more interesting and fun to use, and that's because of how naturally synergistic they are with not only the environment, but also each other. You could create some kind of long, thin platform with a small overhang using Ultra Hand, then use Recall so that it actually stays upright for a while after you hold it up, and then you could use Ascend so you can jump up to the top more quickly, and then you jump off of that using the leverage to use your new fused weapon to hit a bunch of enemies. Like, there's so many ways that you can combine these different abilities to create interesting combat opportunities, to solve puzzles, just to traverse the environment. Like, there are so many cool ways to use these powers that it makes Breath of the Wild feel like a tech demo for what this game truly was. It's like they basically went from being afraid that people were going to break the game with various emergent combinations of abilities and whatnot in Breath of the Wild, and to be fair, they absolutely did. But then they embraced that philosophy and went, hey, what if we just gave them as many cool abilities as possible to try and just break this game wide open? And then they just went wild with it. And to be fair, they actually, I think, take into account all these new abilities much better than Breath of the Wild does. Because while it does feel like you can break the game really easily with all these powers, it also feels like the game was designed around you breaking it. So it doesn't feel like you're actually sequence breaking all that much when you're using these powers to build flying contraptions, to get up to islands, or various things like that. And there's still so many other things that I could be talking about. Bombs are consumable now instead of a rune, which is a good thing in my opinion because it means that they can have room to deal a ton more damage that compared to Breath of the Wild, just like they did in classic Zelda games. There's tons of new enemies that I keep coming across as I play, and there's wholly new bosses and mini-bosses just all over the place, and the champions themselves, like the new modern-day champions as opposed to the ones from 100 years ago, they get to play a much bigger role in both the story and gameplay, where they were severely lacking that in Breath of the Wild. And so yeah, to try and wrap this up in a neat little bow, like I said at the start, this game is just, it's so much bigger and crazier than Breath of the Wild, and everything just feels so much more fun to just explore and experiment with all these different abilities and everything, and there's just so much to love here, and if you love Breath of the Wild, you'll definitely love this even more, and even if you didn't like Breath of the Wild, as I've talked about in my previous videos, I think that this addresses a lot of the complaints that a lot of people had, so I think it's still worth giving this game a shot to see if you might like it, even if you weren't a huge fan of Breath of the Wild. And just to touch on how much bigger and how much more content there is on this new game's map, let me just say that if you've played Elden Ring, and you know what I'm referring to when I bring up the Siofra River Well, and how much of a mind-blowing moment that was, let me just say that I think Nintendo saw that moment in that game and were appalled at the lack of ambition. So yeah, game is good. First impressions, definitely this is an S-rank game, no doubt about it. At some point, I plan on making a more detailed full review of the entire game whenever I finish it. However, even though I've played it for like 3 days straight, non-stop, I feel like I'm still only scratching the surface of this game, so I have no idea how long it's going to take me to actually beat this thing, and when I do, it'll probably take me a little while to actually get out a full review and analysis of the whole game after that, so don't expect that review to come anytime soon. I will try to make some other videos in the meantime, though, and I think that will do it for this first impressions. If you liked what I saw, feel free to give me a like, and I'm always happy to continue the conversation down in the comments, though I will request that everybody try to avoid spoilers if possible in the comments, since, like I said, this is a first impressions, no spoilers video, so I don't want to risk exposing people to something they don't want to see. But if you want to see me make more videos like this in the future, and especially want to see when I put out that full review of this game down the line, I highly recommend you give me a subscription so that you can get notified of when I make that video down the line. And with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.